How does a leader who was once celebrated as a democratic reformer turn into a strongman, one who reshapes an entire region through war? Well, that is the huge question at the heart of Gönül Tol's incredible book, Erdoğan's War. Today, we're going to unpack her deep dive into how Erdoğan's fight for power at home actually lit the fuse for the conflict in Syria, completely redrawing the map of the Middle East.
And right from the very first page, the book opens not with politics, but with this incredibly powerful and just heartbreaking dedication. It tells you immediately that this isn't just some dry academic text. No, this is a story with immense human tragedy at its core. The dedication to Alan Kurdi, the little boy whose image just shocked the entire world, it really frames everything that follows. It's a constant, stark reminder that behind all the geopolitics and the power plays, there are millions of real lives caught right in the middle of it all.
So, to really get into Tol's analysis, we've broken this down into 4 main parts. First up, we're going to look at why this book needed to be written in the first place. Then, we'll trace the story of our argument. After that, we are diving into the absolute core, the 3 most important insights from the book. And finally, we'll take a step back and give a balanced look at the book's biggest strengths and maybe some of its limitations.
Okay, let's kick things off with the central puzzle the book is trying to solve. How on earth did Erdoğan, a leader who was once praised by the West as this great democratic reformer, transform into the strongman we see today? And, most importantly, what does the war in Syria have to do with that radical change? Well, the author, Gönül Tol, is the perfect person to ask. She's the founding director of the Middle East Institute's Turkey program. So she's not just a casual observer. She is a genuine expert who has spent her career researching Turkish politics. And this book, it's built on a ton of interviews with key players. We're talking former high-level officials here, which gives us a really rare look at how these massive decisions were actually made behind closed doors. Right. And to really get Erdoğan, you have to get the Turkey that he came from. Back in 1997, the country's very secular, very powerful military staged what they called a soft coup, kicking an Islamist government out of power. Erdoğan came from that political world, so when his AKP party won a landslide victory in 2002, it was on the promise of a totally different direction, especially when it came to foreign policy.
And that policy was called zero problems with neighbors. The idea was pretty simple. Let's move away from all the conflict. Let's build economic bridges instead. And you know who the poster child for this new approach was? Syria. Erdoğan famously called President Bashar al-Assad my brother. I mean, their families literally vacation together. The book argues that the absolutely spectacular collapse of this relationship is the key to understanding everything that came after. The Syrian war wasn't just a crisis for Erdoğan, it turned out to be his greatest opportunity.
So, how exactly does Talmud connect all of these dots? The secret is really in the book's structure. It's not just a boring timeline of events. It's a really carefully built narrative that shows you, step by step, how Erdoğan's ambitions at home and his foreign policy became the exact same thing. The book's story moves through 6 clear phases. It all starts with Erdoğan consolidating his power at home, taking on the old secular establishment in the military and the courts. Then comes his shift towards a more openly Islamist identity, once his power at home was secure. He launches his big Syrian gambit, seeing the Arab Spring as his moment to lead the region. But when that plan fails, he pivots hard towards nationalism, making the fight against Kurdish groups his new #1 priority. This leads directly to getting tangled up in Syria, which, as the book argues, ends up backfiring, creating a whole mess of political and economic problems back home.
All right, now let's get to the real heart of the book. We've taken Tol's really complex argument and boiled it down into 3 absolutely crucial takeaways. These are the core insights that really help you understand Erdoğan's Turkey today.
Okay, this first key insight is probably the most important one. It completely reframes how you look at pretty much everything Erdoğan does on the world stage. And the insight is this. For Erdoğan, foreign policy was never really about foreign policy. It was always a tool for achieving total control at home. According to Tol, every single move in Syria, every alliance he made, and every conflict he entered into was calculated first and foremost to cement his power inside Turkey.
Exactly, and this slide shows that strategy perfectly. The book goes into detail about how the famous Ergenekon trials were used to basically defang the military. A referendum in 2010 gave him control over appointing judges, taming the judiciary. He squeezed critical media companies with huge tax fines until they were forced to sell to his allies. He was even a master of using alliances. First, he partnered with the Gülen movement to crush the old guard, and then he turned on the Gülenists themselves after the 2016 coup attempt. Even his support for the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood was a domestic move. It let him paint his main secular opposition, the CHP party, as being on the side of the godless Assad regime.
And this idea that foreign policy is really all about domestic goals, it leads us straight into the second key insight, which explains the ideological side of his adventure in Syria.
So Tol's second big argument is that Erdogan's embrace of Islamism wasn't just about his personal beliefs. It was a calculated, strategic choice. He looked at the Arab Spring not as some democratic awakening, but as a golden opportunity to build a whole new regional order with himself at the very center, as the clear leader of the Sunni Muslim world.
Yeah, this Syrian gambit was a huge pivot. The rhetoric just flipped almost overnight. His foreign minister started talking about a neo-Ottoman vision, this idea of Turkey reclaiming its historic influence in the region. In reality, this meant backing the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria almost exclusively and pretty much ignoring all the other opposition groups. The book shows how Turkey became this critical hub, a so-called rat line, for weapons and fighters, including some really hardline ultra-conservative groups to get across the border. The goal was crystal clear: install a friendly Islamist government in Damascus and solidify Erdogan's image as the great defender of the Sunnis.
But as we know, that gambit didn't work. Assad, with backing from Russia and Iran, did not fall. And this failure, this moment of crisis for Erdogan, leads us to the third and probably the most critical insight in the entire book: what he did next.
So when his Islamist project in Syria started to fail and his own power at home was being challenged, Erdogan didn't back down. He pivoted, again. And Tol's argument here is so important. He embraced a hardline, anti-Kurdish nationalism as his ultimate political survival strategy. All of a sudden, the main enemy wasn't Assad anymore. It was the idea of an autonomous Kurdish region on Turkey's southern border.
And the thing that kicked this all off was the June 2015 election. For the very first time, Erdogan's AKP party lost its majority in parliament, and a big reason why was because the pro-Kurdish HDP party did really well. His reaction was swift. He completely abandoned the historic peace process with the Kurds, reignited the conflict, and made an alliance with the far-right nationalist MHP party to hold on to his power. And his entire focus in Syria changed. Military operations weren't about toppling Assad anymore. They were about crushing the US-backed Syrian Kurdish forces. The war was completely reframed for the Turkish people as a patriotic fight for national survival.
So, now that we've laid out the book's main arguments, let's just step back and do a bit of a critical assessment. Because like any really important work, Erdogan's war has some definite strengths that make it a must-read, but also some potential limitations where you could challenge the analysis.
We're going to look at three key strengths: the deep research, that powerful link between domestic and foreign policy, and its clear story. And then we'll look at three potential limitations, kind of framing them as questions. Does it focus too much on Erdogan himself? Does it mistake ideology for just pure pragmatism? And does it maybe overlook the failures of the opposition?
Okay, so the first undeniable strength is just the incredible depth of the research. Tol didn't just analyze events from a distance. She actually went and interviewed the key figures on the inside. We're talking former ministers, diplomats, military officials. This kind of first-hand sourcing gives the book a level of authority and detail that is just really, really rare.
And the book's second, and you could say its greatest strength, is that relentless focus on the link between domestic politics and foreign policy. Tol makes such a convincing case that you just cannot understand what Turkey is doing in Syria without understanding Erdogan's power struggles back in Ankara. And third, it's just a great read. She takes a decade of super complex events and weaves them into this powerful, clear story that anyone can follow. But of course, no book is perfect, and it's worth asking some tough questions. First, because the analysis is so laser-focused on Erdogan's personal agency, his choices, his ambitions, does it risk downplaying other major forces at play? I mean, what about Turkey's deep structural economic problems, or the historical weakness of its democratic institutions? You could ask if those factors were just as important in driving what happened.
Right. The second question is about ideology versus pure opportunism. Is Erdogan a true believer, driven by some grand vision? Or is he the ultimate pragmatist, just using whatever ideology is convenient at the moment to stay in power? The book kind of leans toward the first few, but you could definitely make a strong case for the second. And finally, while the book does a fantastic job analyzing Erdogan's strategy, it spends less time on the other side of the coin, the constant failures of Turkey's divided opposition. You could argue their inability to get it together was just as critical to Erdogan's success as his own political genius. And that really brings us to the final big question that the book leaves you with. It's a question not just about politics, but about legacy.
When historians look back, how will they judge a leader whose foreign wars, which affected millions and millions of lives, were so deeply and personally connected to his own private struggle for absolute power at home? Gönül Tol's book gives us a powerful, detailed, and frankly, a pretty sobering place to start answering that very question.